Thank you to the audience for taking time out of your diary today to join us. I'm really excited to be speaking to Steve today about this subject. Before we start, I'd just like to just to confirm who we are and what our experience is. I'll just briefly introduce myself. I'm Mike Ford. I've been in safety initially in the early 90s, been a member of the Institute since the same time, and moved into what was classed as CSR 20 years ago now, fashionably called sustainability. And the issue of modern slavery, because of my interest in health and safety, has always been a great connection. And I'd like to ask my interviewee if you could just briefly give us a brief outline as your background, Steve, and we will start.
Sure, thanks, Mike. Yes, so I'm Steve Smith. You can probably tell from my accent. I'm Australian, originally from Sydney. I left there 10 years ago. Prior to that, I was working as a consultant, specialising in a number of different fields, so more focused on environmental science and occupational hygiene. I then moved to Dubai in 2011 and worked there for 7 years for Multiplex, leading a lot of our sustainability work, and then was promoted into a broader chef role. And then through a succession plan, I ended up in London 3 years ago, and I'm now across Europe, Middle East, and Canada. But did my bachelor's in science, then went on to a master's of engineering, and I'm a fellow of the Institute. So yes, looking forward to the chat, mate.
Perfect. So, Steve, modern slavery, forced labour, often used interchangeably. Many people I speak to often assume that these things don't happen in the UK, happens in the low-cost emerging economies. Based on your experience, and what I'd like to try and do is create a definition and set the scene of where this practice is occurring. If you could just please summarise in your experience how this is applied, how we're finding this in the construction sector.
Sure. Let's start with some data and some facts, I'd say. In Europe, construction ranks second only to the sex industry as the most at risk for modern slavery. Fact number 2, construction is the second highest risk sector for forced labour after domestic work. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, estimates that 23% of illegal forced labour profits are actually generated in either the construction, manufacturing, mining and utilities industries. So just think about some of those facts that I've just given you, and then absorb this. 7% of the entire world's population, its global workforce, is actually in the construction sector. So some of those numbers are astronomical, and they're in no way just focused in emerging economies. This is a global issue. It is well documented that exploitation in the construction sector globally is rife, with around an estimated of 4.5 million construction workers in forced labour. So I'm not making these facts up. They're widely documented and reported. So with the world of ESG and sustainability and health and safety, we get sort of caught up in knots on definitions and acronyms and jargons, but just to set the scene around definition of modern slavery versus forced labour. So modern slavery is defined as the recruitment, movement, harbouring or receiving of people through the use of a number of things. So either force, coercion, abuse of vulnerability, deception, or other means, simply for the purpose of exploitation. So there needs to be a motive for exploitation there. The modern slavery is more of an umbrella term that captures a raft of different sort of legalities of offences with a very much focus on criminality. Forced labour is a little bit different. So it's very much one component of a broader modern slavery definition and sits alongside human trafficking, debt bondage and child labour. So don't get caught up in the specific definitions in some respects, but yeah, there is a difference, a nuanced difference between modern slavery and forced labour. People often get confused as well between forced labour and exploitative working conditions or substandard working conditions. And the ILO has created a bit of a test just to help and support businesses in trying to work out whether they are experiencing any evidence of forced labour within their business or within their supply chain. So the 6 tests that they use, and you can find this online if you jump on Google, there needs to be evidence of either a threat or physical violence. There needs to be a removal of a phone or a restriction of movement, or even a confinement to a specific workplace or area. There needs to be potentially evidence of debt bondage. So that's where a worker works to pay off debt or a loan and is not paid for his or her services. The withholding of wages and refusing to pay the worker at all, or even excessive wage reductions, retention of passports, and finally the sixth test is threat of denunciation to the authorities. So there's 6 tests. I've gone through very quickly there, but if you meet 2 of those tests out of the 6, the ILO considers that a form of forced labour. So we all know.
Just to be clear, Steve. Sorry, just to be clear, Steve. In the construction supply chain, this includes child labour or underage labour, as well as adults, and that's domestically and internationally.
It can, yes, depending on the locality, the products you're procuring, the supply chain that you're working with. Yes, it can. Yeah, the construction industry is, as I said earlier, struggles with this because they have a heavy reliance on direct migrant workers, both on sites as well as deep within their supply chain manufacturing some of these products. They often have really large, complex supply chains, both laterally as well as vertically. You know, there's often very little visibility of the wages within that supply chain, and some of the tasks that they perform are in some ways considered low skilled. So, you know, that coupled with the fact that the sector is very much driven by lowest cost bidder procurement models, it makes it really difficult and unfortunately exacerbates some of the inequalities in the workplace. So, yeah, a lot of detail and a lot of sort of talking through the definitions, but one other thing actually it's just really important to note, while I've given context around the terms, it's probably important to note that, you know, while we do use the language around modern slavery being a global issue, it's nuanced within each of the different regions. And speaking to experience, you know, a labour market in Australia versus the UK versus Canada versus the UAE are all very different. You know, some regions have unions, collective bargaining agreements in place, others don't. So the labour market conditions are really the fundamentals around whether you're going to have more evidence of modern slavery directly in your supply chain or within your business operations within that country.
Okay, so many of the people who are going to be watching this session today, Steve, are going to be just starting the journey or just starting to define where or how they tackle this issue. So, a bit of a wide-reaching question, but what was the blue light within Multiplex to say this is where we need to develop a program, and what are the first steps?
Yeah, well, I'll probably turn that question on its head a little bit and just let everyone know that I'm sure you've already got the skill set to be able to manage something like this, because in the end it's just risk and opportunity management in some respects. So I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of the core or people on the webinar have the skills. But to dissect the question and focus in on a couple of specific topics, I want to look at, number one, organizational culture and the use of international human rights frameworks. And then secondly, I want to touch on internal governance and management arrangements. So focus on the systems and the processes, the things that really describe and document what we're going to do. So firstly, on organizational culture, and I'm sure we've got many health and safety practitioners and professionals on the webinar today. You know, I'm sure everyone's done a health and safety maturity assessment or culture assessment where, you know, you have a number of different rungs of cultural maturity, and the intention is to move from a lower rung of cultural maturity to a more progressive culture within the organization. And again, sorry, just getting stuck on definitions. For myself, I use the definition of culture as being the combination of leadership, values, behaviours, knowledge and systems. So I use that to frame my thinking around those 5 specific terms. So you can't go off and just undertake a culture assessment without having a predefined set of criteria. How are you going to benchmark your performance against? And that's where the international human rights frameworks come into play. And there's a lot of them, and you can get caught up. I was going
to ask you, Steve. There's a lot of codes of practices out there, whether it be ETI-based code or SGE 21, SA 8000, or whatever. There's lots and lots of them, and there's a lot of niche terminology. Where would you recommend a company starts its corporate learning? Because, as you rightly said, cultural development may be already happening in the safety side, but if we turn that to this, what may be a new subject matter for many individuals, where would you recommend they start? Because some of these codes ask very similar questions, but just ask them in a slightly different way. And some can be quite vague and woolly. So what kind of codes would you recommend if someone's starting the journey that they would look at?
Sure, this may shock you, but I'd probably recommend ISO 31000. Actually have a look at the risk management framework and standard. That will give you a broader understanding of the management framework that you're going to use within your organization. From a human rights perspective, I'd say that the UN guiding principles really are my go-to and our organization's go-to. The protect, respect, remedy framework is widely used and has been in some ways translated through many other frameworks. So for me, number one, UN guiding principles on human rights is really important.
And that's available free as well, isn't it? Which is important to add.
Yeah. Then there's also some great guidance out of the OECD. They have got some guidelines on multinational enterprises. So if you're working for a multinational business with a global setting that has different operations in different regions, that guidance is actually really useful. We used a set of, they're called the DACA principles out of the Institute of Human Rights and Business, more focused on migrant workers, and they were very specific to our operations in the Gulf, but they helped us formulate our thinking around, what were going to be our worker welfare principles, and I'll get onto those in a second.
Yep.
Very recently, so Building Responsibly, it's a multi-stakeholder initiative focused on promoting worker rights and worker welfare in the engineering and construction sector. They've established a range of principles and guidance notes that really, in my opinion, for any construction business now should be the first point of call. So they are sector specific to the engineering and construction sector. And, I recommend that if no one knows about it, they should just jump on the website and have a look. So talked around all these guidance documents and frameworks. What we did with those is develop 8 specific worker welfare principles that were relevant to us. And we landed on number 1, employment standards, number 2, working conditions, number 3, living conditions, because we had direct labour staying with us, number 4, recruitment practices, because we were directly recruiting labour, number 5, access to information and documents, it's around passport retention, number 6, education and training, number 7, fairness and integrity, and number 8, grievances and labour disputes.
And Steve, was that applied internally, or was that applied internally plus supply chain?
Both. So we internalised it because we had direct labour specific to the Gulf, and then we externalised it through our supply chain. UK contact's a little bit different. We only use the supply chain, hence it just rolls down the line and throughout our supply chain. So, but coming back to the culture piece, those 8 principles gave us a foundation to work from. So from those 8 principles, we then moved on and developed a whole range of internal governance processes, leadership capacity building exercises, training exercises, engagements with supply chain to start to build out some understanding, all tied back to those 8 specific principles, if that makes sense.
It does.
So yeah, I guess to answer the question, 3 things I'd say. Number 1, you need to design human rights principles that actually reflect your business. So if you're only a regional business focusing in one region, maybe having an understanding of some of those multinational guidelines or codes of practice are not going to be relevant. I'd say once you have a better understanding of your human rights principles, build your governance arrangements to reflect those, and then like any cultural change improvement program, devise a culture plan to help you get there or get to the desired culture that you'd like to yield.
Excellent. So taking the culture process to its next stage. Every business has got stakeholders. Even if it's only a family company, there's still a stakeholder, or it could be a multinational. It just means there's more of them. How do we get the internal stakeholders, firstly, to accept that this is a potential risk, from reputational risk to safety risk, the full gambit, using the principle you talked about, the citing the ISO standard. And then secondly, and this is something that I've seen personally when I was doing social audits, if someone does accept it, they plonk it with a single department for them to deal with. When I was doing social audits, it was either the HSE or HR departments go and sort this problem out. How do we get, from a business perspective, to get people to understand that this is an issue, there is a real risk, and it is something that's a company-wide issue that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if the audience already knows the answers to this, but this is a boardroom issue. This is not a head of function or a department issue. This is a business-wide issue, and the board needs to be ultimately held accountable and responsible for the decisions on the management of modern slavery risks and opportunities within the business or its supply chain. Directors have a fiduciary duty, and with time, I believe that emerging themes and megatrends around ESG are going to put more responsibility on the shoulders of a fiduciary duty holder with any organisation. So for me, it's a board issue, and for me, my advice to any business really aligns around sort of just general good principles of sustainable business. So step number one, I'd say, in order to embed it within your business, you need to first step back and assess what your organization's purpose really is. Once you understand what the broader purpose of your organization is, that then needs to align with your strategy, your business model, and your operating model, okay? Once you have those things aligned, you can then obviously determine your governance process to reflect, your broader alignment of those business strategies. What you then need to do once you have that alignment is probably what should feed into that process, probably more so, is an understanding of materiality. So, as a principal contractor who has operated in the Gulf directly recruiting labour from the Indian subcontinent, labour rights are a direct material issue to our organisation, and that should be reflected within our purpose and our strategy and our operating model. So it can't just be seen as something that's done off in silo on the side. So I'd say once you have that broader business strategy, tasks complete, the second step is you need to set evidence-based targets, and you need to credibly measure those targets and your progress against those targets, and then transparently disclose your progress. So as an example, you talk about an ethical labour audit. Yes, that may be delegated and discharged to a health and safety function or a human resources function within a business, but ultimately, the progress of the ethical audit should be a reflection of the board's progress with respect to modern slavery. So evidence-based targets, measure, and transparency on disclosure. I even challenge as well, challenge any business that if you're going to undertake external or internal ethical audits, report it and disclose it externally through a sustainability report or an integrated report, whether it be a financial report or any other report where you can disclose progress on these things. The third step really is embedding it within your business. So embedding it into all the decision-making processes, your governance arrangements, etc. And again, if I break it down into the broader culture definition of systems, knowledge, behaviours, and values, wherever you have an opportunity to nudge your people to make certain decisions, you should definitely weave that into your system.
Excellent.
And one that's really important in the construction sector is engage and collaborate and advocate for change. We all use the same supply chain members, and it's more appropriate that we try and level the playing field on a topic like modern slavery versus try and seek any competitive advantage from that. So very much a board issue, in my opinion, and companies that take robust action to tackle modern slavery, in my view, are going to be more resilient over longer term and are more than likely going to suffer from financial and reputational damage. So board issue with discharge responsibilities wherever needed within the health and safety function or human resources function.
Okay, slightly different tact, this next question, Steve, and it's one of personal interest to me because I've seen how the safety profession has evolved in the last 28 years, where more and more has been added to the safety professional's role, and we're now starting to see sustainability and safety marrying in some areas. How can we marry these two disciplines to help address the issue of modern slavery within an organization? Because obviously resources will differ by company. In some cases, they try to merge it because they can't afford the two disciplines or whatever. But how can we take the two together and either make them work together, or if it's a singular role, how can we take that to help address this modern slavery agenda that you've eloquently described previously?
Well, in answering that question, again, empowering the people in the audience, I'd love them to be curious and start to actually scrutinize in some respects some of their departments and some of the processes, etc. So what I'd like to do is just dig a little bit deeper around, you know, while there is a marrying of some of these disciplines in some respects, I'd like to ask a probably more philosophical question around what is a department and why do they exist in some respects, right? Because a business is set out for financial return and valuable positive impact on whatever stakeholder it may be. So let's just challenge that thinking a little bit further. And first and foremost, I just want to touch on organizational design, and then I'll touch on something. It's a 5 capital framework, and it's an emerging sustainability framework that's starting to be used in some respects, particularly in the natural capital and human capital space. So, you know, think of a business, you know, they have an organizational design, and that organizational design and structure is going to be a reflection of really the complexity of the business. You know, we as humans, when we get something that's complex in front of us, we step back and we try and break it down into bite-sized chunks so we can comprehend it and then make decisions for action, right? So it's the same with department design. Now, departments in most businesses, and speaking on behalf, I guess, a construction business, very mix of 2 things: people, the people doing the tasks, and the processes. So the socio and the technical elements of that system, right? The board decides out, you know, the design of that specific org design to reflect the complexity of that business. So let's just use an example: human resources, right? They're responsible for managing, you know, the employee life cycle from recruitment all the way through to maybe promotion and or termination or redundancy. They administer the process throughout that value chain. Health and safety practitioners and professionals are responsible really for the prevention of work-related death, injuries, and ill health. So they're very specifically focused on specific tasks relevant to what they do. Sustainability is a little bit different. Sustainability in some respects is more holistic and in some ways has oversight, not direct responsibility and accountability, but oversight of many different elements of a business. And the way that I best describe this is through the 5 capitals framework. So the 5 capitals framework consists of natural capital, human capital. So human capital is where the health and safety element sits and the modern slavery element sits, as well as human resources. Thirdly, you have social capital, so community engagement, stakeholder engagement, etc. Manufactured capital, so the wonderful buildings that I get to build with my business. And financial capital, the returns for your investors and your shareholders. So why is that important? Really, an organizational design of a business department, you know, should reflect the drivers of the business, and the departments shouldn't just be designed based on a pre-existing set of people or a pre-existing set of ways that things are done. So I challenge the audience to question, you know, whether the org design reflects what they do. And I've worked in a business that's taken or has worked in a silo functioned business that supports operations to now transitioning into an operationally focused business where there's an integration of some of these functional supports. And that really, in my opinion, promotes operational accountability for everything, whether it be modern slavery, health and safety, or sustainability. So the second thing, sorry to get in a little bit more detail, but I want to really sort of poke the bear in some respects, is this concept of systems thinking. You know, and really starting to shift the mindset away from this linear approach of, you know, A to B to understanding the interconnectedness of everything and sort of learning from complexity theory in some respects. Because I don't just say this for the sake of saying this, because I actually genuinely think that when you start to map out some of these systems, you will better understand the levers for change and the barriers stopping us from change. And when we're talking about labor exploitation, modern slavery, or you know, workplace related incidents, we don't want those things to occur, right? They're impacting humans, people, so there's an emotive side to it. So what do I mean by this? Let's just use an example, right? So from a labor exploitation and a labor productivity example, let's just say we win a project. Our project team devises a subcontractor procurement strategy, and that subcontractor procurement strategy appoints a subcontractor, but that subcontractor decides to only use 20% direct labor and 80% supply labor. So supply labor are predominantly on day rates, so you get use of self-employees and or umbrella agencies which promotes this concept of transient labour moving from site to site. So because the day labour are generally charged at higher rates, what they're going to do is try and chase better rates across the city and or cities, and they're going to move from site to site. And that imposes a burden on the principal contractor, spend more time and resources on inducting our people and overseeing new labour coming onto the site. In addition to the fact you also get a detriment to the quality of work, a likelihood of increased incidents, likely a reduction in productivity, and who knows, you may actually miss your targeted deadlines for that project. So
what you're saying, Steve, sorry if I've understood you correctly then, so as part of the due diligence process when you're looking at potential companies, what we should be looking at is their capacity as well when we're selecting them, because obviously that has a direct or potential impact to increase the probability of them importing additional risk in terms of the modern slavery aspect.
Yeah. Yes, that's one lever for change. I think what I'm trying to do is challenge people's mindsets and thinking around, yes, you could take a narrow view and look at the marrying up of disciplines on the topic of modern slavery, but I question whether we should be focusing our attention on looking at the system and understanding the levers for change. And then when you understand the levers for change, then determine who's responsible. And who
when you say system, Steve, are you talking the management system or the actual contractual system? How are you defining the system?
I'm saying all of the little things that make up an output. So as an example,
right,
the subcontractor procurement. So, you know, the lever for change in this subcontractor procurement example is proposed that 100% labour are directly appointed, and there is the use of zero transient labour. By doing so, the likelihood of labour exploitation and modern slavery risk actually falls through the ground. So one simple lever for change.
So one of the main issues that I used to see when I worked in projects when we were doing pre-qualification of due diligence is we rarely looked at the supplier life cycle, which was assessing them, watching them once they've been given the contract, that do their delivery, and then the post-work analysis. We tended to focus purely on the tier ones, and it was very much a standardized due diligence process. How can we improve on that process? Because a lot of the time, once you start getting below the tier ones, it gets murky very, very quickly, especially when you get the subs, triple subs, and so on, working within the supply chain. How can we take it to the next level? Because very often we can be presented at pre-qualification stage with lots of management programs and different check boxes, etc. But how do we take it to the next level? How can we go past that? Because that ticks one box, but the reality is once you get out on site, how can we take that to the next level?
And it's tough. That's a tough topic to tackle right now because of the complexity of the supply chain in some respects. And, you know, digital products are available to whether it be a major contractor, small business, large business, to really help them try and, I guess, weed out some of those risks in some respects. But that's one tool that may work for one business and maybe another tool that doesn't work for another organization. From a pre-qualification due diligence perspective, we won't go into detail on this now, but I just want to remind people that, you know, if you have directly appointed labor, your pre-qualification due diligence processes should reflect the recruitment agencies that you are appointing. Then if you've got supply chain labor, obviously you'll have pre-qualification processes, which every organization on this call more than likely has. But just quite often I see through many of the audits that they often forget recruitment agent due diligence, and that's an emerging topic. The ILO has some great content on that, and I recommend that people have a look at that. From an operational perspective, so once you're awarded the job and you're starting to recruit and procure your supply chain, we have a specific tool in our system called operational due diligence, and that looks at a number of key things. So it looks at ensuring we have appropriate contractual controls in place to make sure that the carrots and sticks are well balanced and going to hopefully get the outcomes that we want. Number two, we interview. We interview a lot of workers because by interviewing and speaking to them and giving them a safe space to voice their concerns.
Are they confidential interviews, Steve?
Yes. Yeah. And look, you know what? Some workers are comfortable in talking, others are not. And we've found that, you know, some are comfortable to talk in a group environment, some are more comfortable to talk in a one-to-one. So it's about giving the workforce the flexibility to raise a grievance, whether that be any of the different examples that I've just explained.
What could you give some examples of questions that you ask? Because I know I think about some of the retailers' work that they've done in this area, and some of it is been in place now 20 years and very good, especially around worker interviews. Could you give an example with to some of the listeners, the types of questions that you ask of individuals, just to give an understanding? If no one has ever done this type of work before, what are the kind of things we should be asking? Because it's very hard to establish trust and confidence to someone who's never met you before, and then you're asking them to disclose certain things that they may think they'll lose their job or could possibly cause them harm or problems. So what are the kind of questions that you would ask, and what are the kind of people skills that those people asking those questions would require?
Yep. So the questions that we ask throughout those interview processes generally align back to our worker welfare principles that I described earlier. So a specific example could be on employment standards, which is our worker welfare principle 1. We may ask a question around payment of wages, and we may say, when are you paid? Are you paid on time? And are you aware of any deductions that you're receiving through that payment? And do you have a payslip, and can you read it? So just those 5 or 6 quick questions. If you have a competent individual that starts to receive some of that feedback from those questions, they will then quickly be able to determine whether there is either a cause for concern and maybe further investigation, or probably saying, you know what, this lady or this man is very comfortable with what they're doing, and you know, we perceive there to be minimal risk of exploitation. So in terms of your second question around skill set, you do need to build a rapport with the workforce and not one size fits all. We've been doing this now for 6 or 7 years, and I would say that some people are comfortable one-to-one, others are comfortable in a group setting. And it's just giving people the alternative options and the flexibility to raise a grievance as they see fit in some respects. So, and you know what, health and safety practitioners and professionals have got that skill set already, because if they're engaging with the workforce and offering that feedback to them on a regular basis, whether it be on a site or not, or a facility, you know, you're building that rapport and that trust between the workforce already. So one other thing I was going to say, sorry, just slipped my mind earlier, was we very quickly realized as a main contractor, we had leverage, contractual leverage. So if a subcontractor wasn't honouring pay slips or payment of wages on time, we had substantial amount of influence and leverage to be able to get the outcomes that we wanted. So, does that answer your question there?
It does, yeah. And you touched on the issue of direct labour and employment agencies, and many may not be familiar with the Cocklepicker disaster in 2004 that happened in Morecambe Bay in the UK. But one of the things that did come out of that is the implementation of a licensing program in the food supply chain. And I've had a lot of direct experience working with that, and I think in many cases it's allowed the gangmaster organisation in the UK to be able to remove certain organisations from this awful practice. There's a lot of talk about licensing in the construction sector, and this has been talked about for quite some time now. What are your thoughts on? Do you think that's a positive thing, and do you think it may happen? Because one of the things we have seen, and in my sector as well, is the issue around modern slavery. COVID has driven that in some cases further down the supply chain and made it a little bit harder to find. Will licensing help us in any way to try and stamp this problem out within the sector?
The closed answer to that is yes. Of course it would. You know, licensing or any other government intervention, if well designed, is a great tool in the toolkit to have. But you know, there's no one solution for this stuff. You know, a government intervention in some respects sort of internalizes a negative externality within the economy, right? So all it does is by increasing either a tax, a subsidy, a tax or a levy, or introducing licensing, all it does is it basically awakens the organisation to start to consider the direct and indirect implications, whether they be financial or non-financial. So,
Yeah.
look, for me, I think in the space of social equity and welfare, including modern slavery, markets have just drifted way too far, and there needs to be a pullback in control and government intervention to get the outcomes we want for people. So.
Yeah, I know we're weighing up the positives and negatives of a licensing program, and I can hear people saying, "Oh, the bureaucracy," but I can say some of the things that I've seen within the food supply chain when I was doing these audits, the licensing process of those organizations simply removed them. They took them out. Did it take them out of it altogether? There's always going to be something there, but it got rid of an awful lot of bad players in the market. Interestingly enough, we've talked a lot about culture, and you've talked a lot about this internal stakeholder movement, etc. And I look at ESG as a top-down, bottom-up approach, and we've touched on both. How can we make this work together better? Because a lot of the individuals who are involved in the going out on site and doing the checks of pre-qualification data, etc., aren't involved in the investor aspect. How can we make these two merge together in a more proactive way? Because a lot of companies I've witnessed, sometimes it looks like two totally separate processes, even though ultimately the goal is the same. How can we improve that? How have you done that in Multiplex?
Well, we haven't tackled that issue, as well as we should have yet, and I don't think anyone has. The world of ESG has just exploded following COVID, and for the right reasons. There's some brilliant speakers out there in the likes of Mark Carney who are really starting to make people think. Yes, there's a lot of momentum around climate action, but going back to what I said earlier around systems thinking, climate lack of climate action is actually a human capital risk, because it's going to put people, it's going to displace communities, it's going to increase temperatures, it's going to put, a hell of a lot of heat stress on many people in already working in arid climates. So, it is a human capital risk. So I only think it's a matter of time. The world awakens, if it hasn't already, to what's going on in the investor community with ESG. And when we say ESG as well, I think there's a two-pronged approach. You have, I think, the investors who are the institutional funds that are conditioning a lot of their money and their debt and their equity with requirements, whether that be modern slavery, action on climate. But you've also got these retail investors that are pushing up as well as a consumer and saying, well, you know what, I'm not going to go and procure that product, or I'm not going to go and live in this building, I'm not going to, support my organisation housing its staff in this office because it's misaligned with my own personal values. So there's a push and a push up and a push down. Institutional and retail, I think, both have a role to play to get the outcomes that we need. So I think
it's also, sorry, I was going to say, Steve, I think it's also got other positive effects in terms of things like recruitment, because a lot of individuals now are becoming far more savvy about this and want to work for organizations that are getting it right and are trying to get it right. I think that's and it's not just recruitment, but also retention as well. I think that's one of the additional benefits of trying to address this activity.
Yeah. And look, not to personalize this, but I was fortunately invited to interview many of our graduates through our graduate program earlier this year, and I would have said 80 to 90% of them in conversation brought up ESG. Two things: ESG and digital transformation. So it's quite clear that if we get that wrong, or any other organisation gets it wrong, you may not be attracting the best talent in the market. So
absolutely, and we're seeing that globally, because we're a global business, and same as yourselves, and we're seeing that, and people who are coming for interview are proactively asking these questions. They're not waiting to be told; they want to know, and we're seeing that all the time. And I think that's a great thing to see. So I'd like to change the tact a little bit now. Because not everyone works for a well-resourced business, and I'd like you just to have a little think about this, because each government has set, we've seen it in Australia where they have the $100 million turnover for modern slavery. Here we have our 36 million. The Netherlands are introducing legislation later this year. The German government's introducing legislation. They're all of a fairly high level turnover. And obviously there's an awful lot of organizations that sat underneath those levels. many well-intentioned businesses are trying to do the right thing. What are the kind of things that they could be doing who don't have the resources that maybe a Multiplex has, or some other, or an Avetta has? What can they do to start addressing this subject on a voluntary basis as well? What are the kind of steps that they should be taking?
Sure, just a couple of points to note. So I'd say that, you know, if you even are an SME in some respects, you're going to be working with a larger firm, one of your customers, right? And those customers that you work for are likely going to have on slavery policy statements, and there will be, you know, certain conditions within your contracts and, you know, risk assessment and method statements to actually fulfill some of those obligations. So I think that from a compliance perspective, that will flow down the line in some respects down the supply chain. Is it that effective? Probably needs to improve, if I'm all honest. Well, one thing I will say, you know, it's really any risk, you know, particularly modern slavery. If you treat your workforce well and you empower them and you give them the right skills and you train them, you will get productivity gains from that. You know, and if you set that out from the start, and I know I talked a bit earlier at a very high level around purpose within the organization, if you truly have purposeful impact within your strategy of your business to bring your workforce along, you're going to get benefits. You're going to get financial returns more like, you know, more in tune with what you actually want to achieve. So I'd say that, you know, there really needs to be a focus on the benefits, the financial benefits that you can get out of treating people with respect, regardless of the big stick that comes contractually or legally. So focus on, like, I mean, genuine purposeful impact within the workforce.
Excellent. So, got a couple before I hand back to Claire, because I believe we have some questions that have come in during the session. A couple of questions that I've identified that I'd like to get an answer and get your opinion on. You've just briefly mentioned the training aspect, and there's lots of e-learning courses and things like that out there. If a company's starting this journey, what are the kind of training that you would give them? Because there's some really good theoretical stuff out there, but one of the things that I often found was missing was recognizing the signs. And there is some fairly standardized signs that are out there. What kind of training would you suggest, and who would you suggest that training is focused at?
Sure. So we generally try and align our external training with industry groups or bodies. So we use Stronger Together, who have a range of training programs to support, I guess, modern slavery improvements with respect to construction as well as other sectors. And we roll that out both internally and externally throughout our supply chain. We've got internally accredited trainers to run that training program. And then secondly is the Sustainability Supply Chain School. So if your organization is a member, you get free access to, you and your entire supply chain actually get free access to that training content. This is all very well thought out content. So that'd be my first 2 points of, I guess, call for any training on modern slavery, specifically in the UK context.
And in terms of getting back to the meat and potatoes here, doing the site inspections, or safety tours, whatever the classification is, what are your thoughts on including training on recognizing those issues whilst doing, because you're already in situ, you're on site. What are your thoughts on making sure that individuals who have, not just safety people, but individuals who have some form of a responsibility out on site to recognize those warning signs out in the site environment?
So what I'd say to that is your people should be trained on how to spot forms of exploitation and/or modern slavery. There are signs. Secondly, a business should have a protocol established for addressing those grievances, whether that be notification to a government authority or not, or whether that's just an escalation up to the board. So 2 things: you need to train your people on how to spot the signs, and secondly, you need an escalation protocol. We've drafted a protocol and we've actually shared that with the GLAA construction group in the UK, as well as Stronger Together, and that's been widely used throughout the industry. So 2 things there.
Okay, so as much as this is information led in terms of preventing this, In terms of the reporting mechanism, would you, because you've touched on that there, would you suggest it's done internally, or other people have capacity to report that externally to a third party? What practice do you use at the moment, or is it a combination?
There's no one size fits all. It's an escalation process, so it depends on the severity of the incident. So we have an escalation protocol that basically shows that higher risk, higher escalation to myself, lower risk through my team to then determine on the course of action. So anything, it's just like an incident classification notification process. So I was saying earlier, the audience are going to have the skill set available to them. It's just getting a handle of some of those broader sustainability topics and understanding the connections to those. So.
Excellent. Right, well, thank you very much indeed for that, Steve. We have some questions that have come in from the people listening, so I'm going to pass back to Claire from IRSM, and if you would be as kind, Claire, to let us know what those questions are. And just before we do that, I just wanted to let people know that Stop the Traffic is an NGO based out of London, but with a global remit. They have just produced a toolkit for SMEs on how to start this program. So post-event, we will be making this paper available to you. It's a free issue anyway, but not everybody knows where to go for that. So we will be making that available to you post-event. Claire, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, first question is, our company only ever works for direct contractors. Is it not the responsibility of the client or principal contractor to do the checks for slavery?
Well, the answer is yes. There should be some form of check on a principal contractor's supply chain, but I guess the level of surveillance and assurance will be risk-based. So, if you're a directly appointed subcontractor with 100% directly appointed labour, there could be a justification to focus efforts elsewhere. But in all honesty, hopefully I've got the message across that modern slavery is really everyone's responsibility, and it's not just up to someone else to check on you. It's you intrinsically wanting to do what's right because you're going to get financial returns out of it at the same time. So.
Thank you. We've got another question here. There was a discussion around evaluation of suppliers' approaches to modern slavery during procurement and onboarding, but how is this looked at for suppliers with which there are long-term agreements? Are there annual reviews with suppliers and/or metrics which you could monitor?
It varies from business to business, obviously, but yeah, we undertake an annual review based on any long-term contracts that are established through our supply chain network, and I would expect that others do the same. So yeah, I would expect there to be an updating of relevant documents to ensure that a subcontractor remains relevant in some respects, whether that be modern slavery or anything. So, Mike, you're an expert in this as well.
I was going to say, I was just going to let you finish, and I was going to say that this is where sometimes technology can be an advantage, because sometimes you've got multi-site working, and if we don't get any joined up thinking, you could have a company that's doing something they shouldn't be doing in the north of the country, and in the south of the country they could be fantastic. So it's really important to look at the full supplier life cycle, and it's not just a case of simply just looking at do they have adequate insurance, etc. It's a case of monitoring them and then conducting sensible post-work analysis, not just did they have any accidents. No, next question. Let's look at this in a more granular way and let's get some value from this process. I think that's one of the downsides sometimes to how we do due diligence. We don't do it in a smart way, and sometimes we tick boxes. I think we have to look at this in the round, and we have to look at it as a life cycle. The project may be 2 years, but the contractor may be only on site for 3 months. So let's look at what they're doing to get through to contract award, but then analyze them whilst they're on site, and then post work. Let's look at this in an added value assurance way, and look at the outputs. And then one of the technological aspects is that we can monitor them from different sites, because we have some companies who work through our system that could be based in mainland Europe and based throughout the UK. And in certain sites, they're fantastic, and others maybe not so. So sometimes technology can be useful where that's concerned. And I think it's important that when you look at a solution to assist you with this, that you make sure it covers far more than just the stage 1 assessment, because stage 1 is just one step of the journey.
Thank you. So the next question is, with new eligibility to work checks starting in June this year, is this a good time to include checking on a worker's status to make sure they're not subject to forced labour?
Yes, my answer, I've been asked that question, I think yesterday as well, and my answer was it should already be performing right to work checks anyway. So, you should already be checking eligibility of a workforce on your sites, wherever it may be that you're operating in. So, yes, there's more complexity around the June 1 date, but yeah, the check should already be embedded within the processes for any of the principal contractors that you're working for.
It's interesting enough as well, just to add what Steve said. I mean, this is a process that's been in place now for quite a long time, and it has changed at least 4 times to my knowledge since it was introduced. But we are seeing clients who are asking us to introduce new content to ensure that this evaluation process is cascaded down the supply chain. The tier ones, the strategic suppliers, tend not to have too many issues. They tend to have this button down. It's once you start looking at the subcontractors who are then subbing and so on, many just don't even know this is a requirement. And as Steve said, this is something that should have been done for a very, very long period of time. But clients are now starting to ask us is how can we look further down the supply chain to make sure that people who are coming into the country to work are legally entitled to work here. And again, it's literally going to be an education process, especially for the smaller suppliers who have maybe never done this previously.
Thank you. A comment here, having a conversation on modern slavery in the workplace will give confidence to workers to speak out. A policy on its own is really not as helpful as those conversations. That's just an observation there. Did you want to comment on that?
Sure. Look, you draw a parallel to the world of health and safety, right? So, just by even debriefing a work task once it's been complete, the learnings from that conversation, can be taken away and then reapplied within the next time that you actually perform that task. So it's exactly the same with respect to exploitation. The problem is with exploitation, it can have elements of criminality, and there is in some ways people scared to speak up. So it's about giving them that safe space to be able to raise those issues.
Yeah, I would add, I think it's essential. I mean, it's the old adage, actions speak louder than words. I mean, how many times have you seen a safety policy or a statement of intent and it's just flowery, woolly stuff? One of the things that we need to be wary of, one of the biggest incidents of modern slavery found by the gangmaster folks up in the northwest of England, everything was, as they say, above board. It was via an employment agency. And they had all the necessary paperwork in place. So you have to do checks. You have to speak to people, because if you don't, on the surface everything looks fine, but the reality is, and this was in the hundreds, that they found individuals that were subject to modern slavery. But like I say, if you don't ask the questions and you don't speak to people, and as Steve said, engage with people, then it's just warm words, and it won't really do anything. It'll tick a few boxes, but it won't solve the problem.
Hey, look, the vast majority of people that I work with within my own organization and within our supply chain, and even clients and consultants, they're all good people. They all want to do the right thing. I think that this is an emerging topic where people are still trying to learn and understand some of the complexity behind exploitation. It's masked in some respects. So yeah, genuinely, I think that people want to do the right thing. They just don't know how to yet. And I'm hoping with this movement of ESG, it will raise the profile of some of these, topics that haven't been discussed, so openly. The Modern Slavery Act has done its job in some respects, but it's been rather weak on enforcement. So yeah.
Yeah, I would just add there that, and as Steve's just said, I think people are now starting to recognise that this is not something that doesn't happen in the UK. You've only got to look to last summer, major textile provider in Leicester, and that's still happening now. And the impact of that organisation's brand is horrendous. They've just been prevented from working in and selling their products in the United States, and that's a year later, and they've lost over $1 billion off their share value. So the reality is that these are things that have to be brought up, and people don't want to to push this. They want to do something about it, and in many cases, it really is about educating oneself that this is happening and can happen in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
and understand as a business owner, there is a commercial opportunity that lies ahead. If you invest,
Absolutely,
in people, you give
yes.
them the right training, they have the right skills, you're going to get productivity gains. It's about taking that longer term view versus looking just at the end of your nose, 1-2 years down the line. So no difference with climate action. There are commercial opportunities that lie ahead for the smart. So the ones that adapt and transform, they'll be around. The ones that don't won't survive.
Yeah, I would just finish, Claire, before we finish. There's a famous academic who made the statement that there's nothing wrong with making a profit, but you can still do the right thing. And that's a really, really important summary to finish up on.
We did have one final question, which might be a good one to end with. If we suspect something is not right, who do we report this to? We've just got a minute or two left for that final one.
Well, it depends on your location. So, if you're in the UK, there's a number of different authorities that you can report to, and it depends on the severity of the incident. So in some cases, it may be the police, it may also be the GLAA. So generally, I'd say that you need to do a bit of research and understand your geographical context and then the type of incident that needs to be reported. Sorry, it's not a straightforward answer, but yeah, you need to have an understanding of the nuances of the local authority reporting. But if you're on a tier 1 contractor site, straight up to that tier 1 contractor, because they'll have the skills and the resources to address it. So,
and all I would add, I've had 2 occasions where I've had to speak to the GLA, reporting concerns from ethical auditing, and their support service is excellent, and there is no danger to you as an individual when reporting this. It is perfectly anonymous, and they know what to ask and they know what to do, because their service is information led totally, and all their prosecutions are all driven from what they've been told by individuals reporting things. Most recently, only last week, an individual who was been in modern slavery for 40 years, living in a garden shed in the northwest of England. And that was information led. So yeah, absolutely. Speak to those individuals, and also, as Steve's mentioned, if you're lower down the supply chain, tier 1, or the principal contractor.
Okay, that's lovely. Thank you. We've had some great feedback. So an enjoyable webinar, and big thanks to Stephen and